This episode is on the battlefields of the Civil War, and so the nature of the Civil War. I've subtitled it, War is All Hell. That's a quote from William Tecumseh Sherman, whose concept of war was that it would and should affect the civilian population, and he would bring the Civil War to the South's civilian population by his march to the sea. We often see that as the Civil War is one of the first wars in modern war history. This picture, too, is from the Antietam battlefield. Antietam is known for having the single day of the most casualties in the Civil War, and that was 22,000. So we'll say a few things about Antietam. First, let's look at the generals on both sides. As we know, Lincoln had a hard time finding his general to lead his army and to lead the Army of the Potomac. His first general was Winfield Scott, whose Anaconda strategy actually worked, as we talk about in the last episode. He had an idea that you would slowly strangle off the South's ability to fight the battle by taking away its coastline, taking away the Mississippi River and the rivers in Tennessee, and then finally strangling its war effort. And that's what the Anaconda strategy was about. That's what happens de facto over the war. But at the inception of the war, Lincoln was unhappy with the slowness with which such a strategy would be employed, so he replaced Winfield Scott by McClellan, who took a survey of the troops, most of whom were green, as we said, and decided that it was much more important to train them first before he engaged in battle. And so he was slow to go to battle because he wanted the military that he thought could win the battle. So he is really credited for having made a ragtag army into a professional operating. So he does do a lot for the military, but once again, not taking it to the battle to the South fast enough for Lincoln. So Lincoln goes through a lot of generals before he finally, in the last year of the war, has advanced Ulysses S. Grant to the head of the military in 1864. And Grant would finish the war for him, and he was very famous for doing exactly what Lincoln wanted, which was to fight and keep pursuing the South relentlessly. So he is the general that will succeed in being the Eastern Army of the Potomac commander, and then Sherman will be his fifth column, I guess. In the South, he will, from the West, take the South all the way dead middle of the South with his march to the sea. That's total warfare, not just battles between armies on battlefields, but taking the war to the civilians. And he would then come up on the backside of Lee, who was the leading general of the North, and Lee would then surrender to both Grant and Sherman. Lee, of course, leads the Southern Army for the full 4 years. He is an expert strategist and has a good team with him, the first of which was Jeb Stuart, who was his cavalry commander and his go-to man for especially reconnaissance and knowing what the other side's military, both numbers and positions of the military on the other side. He had a great commander under him, Stonewall Jackson, who was kind of like Grant, stuck it out on the battlefield at all costs, hence he got the name Stonewall. Longstreet was Lee's backup as a strategist, so he was another general under Lee, and he was his expert strategist as well. So Lee had a good team advising him, and he would stick it out through the war, and these guys would fight a war against the North that obviously frustrated Northern efforts to defeat them for 4 long years. And these generals would see over 700,000 deaths due to the war and on the battlefield. So it's going to be a long, brutal war. The brutality of the war is partly due to the new technology and especially both cannons and repeating rifles. Right? Repeating rifles. Rifle itself means that you have a rifled, oh gosh, a rifled barrel to your gun, and that means that it's got grooves so that the bullet comes out spinning and it's more accurate. So the important thing about the rifle is that it is more accurate, so you hit your target more often, and then repeating, obviously you can shoot many rounds at once without reloading, and so then that made you much more deadly, and it was much more deadly on the battlefield. The battlefield, given cannons and such, was much more deadly, so the Civil War, they start to dig in and use trenches and fortifications. So these are some of the new things, not completely new, but new things that would make the casualties much more high and the effort to defend against high casualties. The hot air balloons are something that's new, so this is an innovation in the war, and they did try to use hot air balloons for reconnaissance. They also built ironclads. These are quasi-submarine boats that just have a turret sticking above the water, and a turret is just a covering for a machine gun or a Gatling gun or a repeating gun of some sort. And then below the water is the whole boat. So it's quasi-submarine, and it's ironclad. So it was made all of iron so that it could, that any round shot against it would just bounce off. Both the North and the South build ironclad boats. Right? So hot air balloons and the ironclad are both new innovations in the Civil War. And then finally we have, of course, as you know, the railroads and the telegraphs going up. Railroads obviously made the North much stronger, and the telegraph much stronger because you could move supplies and men to any battlefield a little bit more quickly anyways. And the telegraph because communications could be, there was broad communications across large areas relatively quickly. So the speed to which you could get your troops and your men and your communications on the battlefield was improved by those two things. And we know, especially for the North, since it was crisscrossed by railroads, whereas the South had a little bit less. The first battle that they fight after the war breaks out from Fort Sumter is called the First Battle of Bull Run, and it's fought in July of '61, and I want you to notice it says the first battle. This is an eastern battle between armies that are set up between D.C. and Richmond, so it's not too far from Richmond, and it's the first battle, which means they had a second battle of Bull Run, a battle in the same place, and that's the characteristic of the Eastern theater in the Civil War, that they fought battles and then they refought them in the same place. So that's the first thing about the first battle of Bull Run. Secondly, we want to just look at the battle because here it is. We have Lincoln with a not so trained army, but he wants to have a show of force. And so he gets McClellan to get out there and fight a battle with Lee at a place called Manassas Junction. It was also called Bull Run, so the battle is often called Bull Run. It's in this battle that Stonewall Jackson gets his name Stonewall, and again, it tends to mean that he stuck it out on the battlefield like a stone wall. Where that name actually comes from, we're not really sure. He is pictured on the right-hand side, and he would die in '63 at Chancellorsville. So we'll see maybe a little bit of that. But so one of the Southern generals really finally, right, is killed in battle. The Southern victory, this is a Southern victory. So they go out and they fight, and the South has a great defeat. The North is nowhere ready to fight against a Southern army that is well trained, and it has a whole tradition of young men going into the military. So they were ready as an organization, as a military organization, the way the North was not. So one of the Southern strengths, and it showed here, right? So what made the South so strong. It had a fighting force that was very loyal to its cause. Remember, the North doesn't. It had a very cohesive and strong esprit de corps, right? They were ready to fight, and they conducted themselves as a military unit ready to defeat, and that really helped out with the battle. And then finally, we always say in this first battle sort of is the shows the strength and is kind of the undoing in a way of the South, because they get this overconfidence. They were so victorious in the Battle of Bull Run that the Southern confidence ran really high, and we consider that an overconfidence. And the Greeks had a term for this overconfidence. They called it hubris. And hubris meant not just overconfidence, but that overconfidence was a flaw, and that would ultimately lead, too much confidence ultimately met its nemesis, and its nemesis was what would bring it down, right? So this first battle is often seen as, wow, the South really thought they were going to defeat the North and be free of the North. And they had something coming to them, because the North obviously is going to have much more supplies, and it's not going to relent, right? So this first Battle of Bull Run gave that South that overconfidence that it could do anything. It made it clear to the North that it was completely unprepared, not completely, but unprepared. So they had a lot of work to do. So these guys dug in to start to build a military that could defeat this Southern unit. And also, they were amateurs, and the last thing about the Battle of Bull Run was it was just this chaotic retreat. So the Northerners are losing the battle, and the soldiers turn to retreat back to Washington, D.C., and on the way back they meet audiences that are coming out to see the Civil War battle. So at the beginning of this war, like the beginning of every war, people are kind of excited about war. They want to go out and see, and then eventually as the carnage gets bad, nobody likes war, right? So early on in the Civil War, audiences went out to go see the men shooting at each other. I know that sounds kind of odd, but there was a good likelihood that bullets would miss you in this day and age, so it wasn't quite like they are now. All right, as far as strategy, just to rehash some of what we've talked about, you have the gray states, which are all the Confederacy, and they have seceded from the Union. So the strategy for the North is going to be the famous Anaconda, and it worked according to its geography, right? Cut off the coastline here, the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and then claim the Mississippi River, so all the supplies going up and down the Mississippi River can't happen. We'll see that happen by 1863. And then to take the rivers too and cut off the supply line and invade through Tennessee and down into Georgia. And strangling effect, cut through Georgia. William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea is going to be right straight through this Georgia region, and then he'll take his military up and towards Lee's military in Virginia, and then Lee is surrounded on both sides, so he surrenders. So the Southern strategy is defensive mostly, and the defensive position is a war of attrition, right? So just keep fighting and keeping them off of Southern soil, right, or thwarting their efforts, and then they'll eventually tire out. And you can see how this might be seen to be something that would work, because Lee does win most of the battles in the Eastern Theater himself. So there was reason to think that maybe just keeping them off, just this attrition, they'll keep hitting and they'll finally tire out, you'll exhaust them. And then finally, for 1 year, one campaign, Lee decides he's going to destroy the Northern Army, and that's the campaign that ends with the Battle of Gettysburg, and that is really the transformative phase of the war. But so the war had an offensive strategy temporarily, where it invades the North. It'll fight 2 battles in the North, Antietam and Gettysburg. The North, then, I've just described the Anaconda strategy for you. So those are the two sides and the strategies that they're employing. Now let's look at some of the battlefields. In the Eastern Theater for the North, you have the Army of the Potomac, and the Army of the Potomac was a trial and error effort on the part of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, as we said, trial and error. Put generals in, see what they can do. If they don't succeed in doing things that you want, then put another one in. So he went through a lot of generals. McClellan, the perfectionist, built his military, refined his military. He then, and just so you can see, right, he had Burnside, he had Pope, he had Hooker, he had Meade. When the battle goes to Gettysburg, Meade is the general. And then finally he gets Grant, and with Grant, Sherman, and the last year of the war. And these guys will finish off the war for him. Then also in the Eastern Theater, the federal government, the North, puts up a blockade, which is relatively successful. The South has blockade runners, and they do succeed in getting supplies to the South, but boy, the blockade and the war really wreak havoc on the Southern economy nonetheless. And like I said, the Southerners impressively try to keep up with the North's abilities on their naval abilities. So the South will as well be inventing an ironclad. They will, because they don't have a navy sitting out there, transform all sorts of merchant ships into naval boats. And so they are very inventive in this period in creating their navy. The South builds the Merrimack as its ironclad, and then the North has the Monitor, and then just quickly, the only battle that we usually talk about on the ocean was between the Merrimack and the Monitor, and that battle between the two would come to a draw. So this new technology is interesting, but nothing is gained for either side by the new technology. The Western Theater is in some ways more important, at least up to 1863. Right? So the armies of the West will be led, actually before Grant, but Grant, it will become the leader of the armies of the West when they take the forts on the Tennessee that give them advantage, and that finally take the Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. And so Grant had all the qualities, they always say, that Lincoln wanted. Right? He was bold, and we'll see that. He would take his men all the way across these rivers and put them straight into battle with the Southern military sitting right on the banks of the other side. He was very resourceful too, so he fought a war, the Vicksburg siege, without a whole lot of resources, but he had his men, as is often said about generals who are resourceful, live off the land, and they did extraordinary things to defeat Vicksburg. He was dogged, he doesn't relent, and then once he defeats an army, he does it and demands unconditional surrender. In fact, they called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. So Grant's philosophy of warfare was fight it to the bitter end and subdue your enemy, right? A couple of battles in the Western Theater. The two significant ones. Shiloh was a important battle because they will secure the Tennessee River. Grant will win this battle. It's a 2-day battle, and he has to cross the river to attack the Southern forces. That's the first most amazing thing he does. He does get his forces across the river. He's successful in sending his Brigadier General William Tecumseh Sherman around the back to fight and obviously to defeat the South by a by surrounding, right, the Southern forces. And so that will be a successful battle plan, obviously. The consequences, though, this is an interesting battle. So he wins. And there's a big controversy about Grant in military history, and that controversy is whether he was drunk on the battlefield. Nobody argues about whether he liked his alcohol or not. But whether he commanded his forces inebriated is a big controversy. I don't know where you or I stand on this, but here it is. Right after Battle of Shiloh, there were, like there are in many modern wars, journalists that were there, and they wrote stories that Grant had a drinking problem, and so they wrote stories, and so that got back to Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln said, right, I don't know what his taste in alcohol is, but whatever it is, give him 2 barrels of it. So according to Lincoln, he wasn't so concerned that Grant had a drinking problem or not. He just wanted a man who got in there and fought to the bitter end. That's one side, and that's one point of view from Lincoln forward. The other side is, and then there are those who said, well, he drank, but he wasn't drunk on the battlefield. The other side looks at it and says, well, but he lost so many men in battles, and that's signature Grant. 13,000 dead and wounded, so 13,000 casualties at the Battle of Shiloh, so that's a lot of casualties, and we'll see that he brings in lots of casualties when he becomes the commander of the Army of the Potomac. So that's what's controversial about it. If he was inebriated on the battlefield, making bad calls and costing the lives of his men. And so there are historians who argue that side of it. So that's the arguments on both sides, and you can decide for yourself, because there's a more important battle, obviously, that he wins, and that is Vicksburg. Vicksburg will secure the Mississippi for the North. On this map, you can see the river on the left-hand side as it winds its way up, the the gray winding river. Right at the top, you can see a fort up here, and that is the Vicksburg Fort. It sat like a Gibraltar, as we'll say in just a moment, on the Mississippi. So it sat on a high precipice. So it was almost impossible to attack this fort, and that, well, they're going to lay siege to it, but they didn't think that they could even defeat it in that fashion. And sitting on the high precipice on the Mississippi, it could guard everything going up and down the Mississippi, and it was luckily on a bend in the river as well, so everything that was coming and going, it was almost a surprise, right? Or there was just very difficult to get around the Vicksburg point, right? The Vicksburg Fort. So this is the fort that they want if they want to secure the Mississippi, and so that was Grant's task. So here he is. He's on the west side of the Mississippi here with his military, and he will send Sherman into the swampy areas to the north, and he will send a whole contingent of troops all the way around the back out to Jackson, and then straight out around a very heavily both marshes and forest in this region. So it was really hard to get through the area, and they would go out and lay siege to Vicksburg from the eastern side, and this siege would last for 2 months. The whole campaign lasts about 5 months to get Vicksburg, but the siege will last 2 months, and then the South will be defeated. And so that's why they look at Grant as both resourceful and dogged, right? This was almost an impossible task, and he stuck it out, and he had his men do extraordinary things, right? Go extraordinary distances in very tough terrain to finally to defeat the South. And so that's what, after Vicksburg, which is won in July of 1863, 1 day after Gettysburg. So the 2 most significant battles in this Civil War are won in 1863, 1 day after each other, right? Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And Lincoln's going to like this about Grant, so he's going to be more than excited after Vicksburg to get Grant to be the head of the Eastern, and everybody knew Grant after this as well. So he became very famous from this battle at Vicksburg. So Vicksburg was the Gibraltar. It would make it so that the North controlled all the traffic on the Mississippi, so that was very significant. The siege went on again for 2 months, and finally the fort surrendered, so that was a big victory in mid-1863. a day after Gettysburg, which was the other big victory for the North and stopped the South from ever going into the North. After Vicksburg, Grant's going to be advanced to the chief of the armies of the U.S. and the head of the Army of the Potomac, and Sherman would be given a command of 100,000 troops strong and be a run the Western Army and command against the South and take Atlanta, Georgia, and then he would do his march to the sea, and we'll see that in a second. But first, let's look at Lee's last effort or his first and last effort to attack the North on northern soil. So it was two-pronged, one into Antietam in Maryland and another one up into Pennsylvania. He hoped to come around the backside of D.C. and defeat the North. So by 1863, it almost seems to me he has a desperation, right, to abandon his war of attrition and now try to stop the North in their tracks. So they will fight straight in towards D.C. at Antietam. Again, Antietam is, and then go up to Gettysburg. So Lee would lead a military up to Gettysburg. Antietam comes to a draw, and Antietam was a battle fought in Maryland. It is the bloodiest day. It has the bloodiest day of battles, we said already, with 22,000 casualties. And it is a 3-day battle, and it comes to a draw. And that's the sad thing about it, right? So many casualties. And we know that if you don't die on the battlefield, but you're wounded, you're very likely to die of disease or gangrene or something that infection that from your wound anyway, right? So that was a horrible battle and a horrible day of battle, and all for nothing. Basically, it came to a draw. So very sad on his first. Lincoln, after Antietam, will write the Emancipation Proclamation. So after this battle, he will free all slaves in the Confederacy, and more importantly, the Emancipation Proclamation allowed for blacks to enter the Union Army. And then we said, right, 186,000 by the end of the war have joined the Union cause. Lincoln himself went out to the battle at Antietam to see what was going on, so he was an active commander in that sense as well. And here you can see him with McClellan and Pinkerton, and I think Pinkerton on the left-hand side, the short, well, they're both kind of short actually, but the shorter guy is the more interesting because he will start the first private eye business in the United States after the war. So anyways, this is Abraham Lincoln out on the battlefield. And then the second prong, right, Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is more famous because this is the turning point for the South, as is Vicksburg, one day after each other, right? 3 days of Battle of Gettysburg. The first day it starts out as a skirmish between the two armies. It's just an incidental event, and then the two armies show up for the second and the third day at Gettysburg, and they will fight it out for 3 days, and Lee will have a terrible loss here in Pennsylvania. He has a strong team with him in this, both Jeb Stuart and Longstreet. Longstreet advises him against the third day of battle. The third day of battle is famous for Pickett's charge. So he had a General Pickett who was in charge of a company that was commanded to do a frontal attack on a Union army that had the high ground on it. And they were just blown to pieces. After the battle's all over on the third day, Pickett said he didn't have a unit left. He had no company left. He had no men in his company left. So it was a very sad thing for the South, or at least these men fighting in battle, that they were commanded to do a frontal charge against an army that was well armed with cannons, repeating rifles, and ready for the assault, and had the high ground. Meade led the Union forces, and this would be a victory for Meade. And this ends the South's efforts at offensive. So this is the end of any sort of offensive on the part of the South, and a big loss for Lee, one of the few battles that he loses. He does not lose too many. And that's the beginning of the end for the South. So in 64, we have Sherman, who has fought his way all the way into Atlanta, and he would march to the sea from Atlanta, Georgia to Savannah, Georgia. And that march to the sea was about 250 miles. He covered a swath, his army, of about 60 miles on either side. He took a zigzag pattern down the through the territory, kind of avoiding the Southern military and fighting with it. And so he's seen the opposite of Grant as having saved his men in many ways by zigzagging and avoiding frontal conflict with the Southern military, and then practicing what is called scorched earth policy, destroying the Southern lands, their resources, their very ability to make war is how he saw it, right? So this took it to the civilian population. You want to note one thing for the Western Army: taking it to the civilian population does not mean killing civilians. It means making their lives miserable and difficult. Western military, they fight soldier against soldier, and that's the tradition. So a civilian, unarmed civilian, is not a target of a Western military broadly, philosophically. I mean, obviously on the ground soldiers do what they do, but he did not go down in there to kill and to kill civilians, but to make their lives miserable. And so, scorched earth policy. That was to destroy their ability to make war, to destroy their resources, to destroy their farmlands, to destroy their cattle, etc. Right? He also is famous, and I skipped over this, for having left his supply lines in Atlanta. So he, like Grant, very resourceful military, right? We're going to live off of whatever we can find down here. And in this fashion, then, Sherman could make war hell for the population, and hence his quote, "War is all hell." And we call this total war, right? Not just battle on the battlefield between two armies, but a war that affects the home front in one way or the other. So Sherman's seen as understanding war in that fashion, and therefore being the first modern commander. So historians have called him the first modern commander. Now Grant, in the Eastern Theater, I have a nice quote from him because it kind of resonates even with Lee. "I determined to hammer continuously against the armed forces of the enemy and his resources until by mere attrition, if in no other way, the military power of the rebellion was entirely broken." And I think you should note the word attrition there, right? For Grant, it was also a war of attrition, but a war of attrition that would finally break the rebellion. So the end of the war, I want to just say a few things about Grant in his last year as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. He does run a war of attrition, meaning keeping Lee at battle all the time. His overland campaign, then, he went from battlefield to battlefield, and then we said, his numbers of casualties are high, so this is what I want to look at on these battlefields. Most of these are won by Lee or come to a draw, right? But Sherman will lose 17,000 at Chancellorsville, casualties. Spotsylvania, 12,000 casualties. Cold Harbor, right, 12,000 casualties, right? You add all those together, you got 41,000 casualties there. So that's a lot of casualties in one campaign at the end of the war, right? And again, those casualties, many of them are going to die because there's no antibiotics. Sherman cut the South in half with his, and Lee then is surrounded by two armies, one in front, one in back, and saw that there was no way for him to fight this war anymore. So he surrendered at Appomattox, and that's just about 80 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia today, and they have a museum there. We see here the two generals at the end of the war, Lee on the left-hand side, Grant on the right-hand side. And here are the terms of surrender. They may surprise you. They have the actual written document by Grant at Appomattox Museum today. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed by me to receive them. This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return home, not to be disturbed by the United States authorities so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside. And that last part, the laws in force, the Congress obviously is going to start changing those laws for them. And they will not allow those who led the war effort to be enfranchised. They'll disenfranchise the leaders so they can't participate in politics, right? And also, too, you want to see that they gave back the private property of all of the military, and they took only what was part of the Union, the federal government's property back. So that's the end of the battlefield and the end of the battle in the Civil War. And we will then turn to Reconstruction in our next discussion. So the battle turns around for the North in 1863 with two big victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg in July